welcome, Deirdre. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me about the state of economic theory and thought.
Glad to. I've just written a couple of books on that, so it's timely.
Exactly. And one thing I have to ask you on a very personal question is, you were educated at Harvard.
I was.
Which is a saltwater school.
I did,
At the time when this discussion between freshwater and saltwater was very big.
Yeah.
And then you went to a freshwater school.
I did.
Can you please tell me, what was the difference? Was it the same intellectual environment? How was it like?
No,
I just simply need to know this.
It was a very different intellectual environment. At Harvard, where I went to undergraduate school and then went to graduate school, Harvard, this was in the early 60s, early to mid 60s. The Harvard economics department was at a low point.
Okay.
What had happened is that they had hired a lot of promising young men in the early 50s, mid 50s, who didn't work very well, who didn't become great economists. And I could name them, but it's impolite. I don't want to make their grandchildren unhappy. But so economics was not very good at Harvard, which is a little unusual because Harvard has good departments in most departments. Whereas the great, exciting, creative work in economics was being done mainly at the University of Chicago. The notion of human capital was invented there. Monetarism was coming into favor. Rational expectations. Economic history, my field, was applying economics to history in a big way, really serious. That was very strong at the University of Chicago, and we were one of the pioneers of it. And on and on and on. The economics of education was strong at Chicago. Agricultural economics, especially applied to what we then called third world countries, poor countries, was very strong at Chicago with Theodore Schultz and others. So it was a great place to go to be an assistant professor, which is what I was from 1968. And then I was there for 12 years and got what we call tenure in the United States there. And that was the big difference. In terms of the history of economic thought, the big difference was that at Harvard, you were to view economic theory and even economic facts as kind of a portrait of the economy. And you were taught to look at the economy as though it were an art object, and then you would criticize it. Mm. Whereas at Chicago, the formula was apply it to real economic problems. And the great figure there was Milton Friedman, who he was someone gave me a good phrase, and I forget the phrase exactly, but application. And that's what I like to do as an economic historian. It was wonderful to be able to use micro and macroeconomics to talk about the great historical issues.
That actually segues very well into the next question, because how do you view the state of economic theory today, particularly the price theory, which you taught at Chicago?
Yeah. Well, there's a phrase that Imre Lakatos used, degenerating research program. And I'm afraid that's what most economics is these days. I don't mean that it's all wrong or we should throw it all away and start over again, but I mean that there are a lot of sort of pointless wheel spinning. And I'm old. I've seen a lot of this in my life. When I was in graduate school at Harvard, the big thing was activity analysis, namely input-output analysis, which I did, or linear programming, and that was the big deal. Within 5 years, it was dead intellectually. Some of my classmates, alas, didn't get the memo and didn't know that it was dead, but it was dead. And I've seen this over and over and over again. in the fashions of economic theory. And, they just keep coming up, in macro especially. Every 5 years there's a new theory. And it's not getting anywhere. I have an essay that's about empty economic boxes, which was a phrase that an economic historian named John Clapham used in 1922 to describe what economists were doing then. That they weren't finding out how big these things they were talking about, what they were. They were saying, well, there are externalities, but they didn't ever calculate how big they were or how important they were to changing supply and demand equilibrium. They just didn't get it. And the same is true now. For example, in the last half century or so, informational asymmetry has become a big deal in economics. And people are told, oh, this is a terrible failure, an imperfection in the marketplace. Well, from the Austrian economics point of view, it's not an imperfection, it's a feature.
Exactly. Yeah.
That is, I know more about, baseball than you do. And if you want to learn about American baseball, come to me. I'll tell you about it. You know more about the Danish language than I do. And it's a disequilibrium, but it's a reason for us to talk to each other. And the same is true of trade. That there are informational asymmetries is why we form branded companies, for example, to avoid informational asymmetries. It's why we change, why we move at all. So I don't know. I'm somewhat depressed about it all. The way price theory, that is microeconomics, is taught in most graduate programs is shockingly bad. It's treated as theorem proving. And if you talk to physicists or chemists or biologists about their fields, or historians for that matter, they never say, what we need is more theorems. They always say, we need more ideas and tests of the ideas, empirical tests. And economists think that econometrics is going to do that, and it doesn't very well.
I agree.
So I have a book that came out this spring called Humanomics, which gives another way forward. Then I've got a book coming out also from the University of Chicago Press in a month or so called, what's it called? Against Positivism. And the first one is kind of a nice, friendly statement, and the second one is kind of a nasty, critical statement. In both cases, what's wrong with modern economics?
So let's talk about humanomics first.
Yeah.
The friendly version of it.
Yeah.
It's the friendly version.
Well, the friendly version is that an economics ought to keep the humans in. The problem with economics, one of the problems with economics, is we tend to think of we tend to think of humans as vending machines. You take your money, you stick it into a person, and out comes a product. And that's not completely wrong. If I want to buy your watch, I offer you something, and if the price is good, you sell me your watch. But it's very incomplete. It leaves out meaning entirely. It focuses entirely on behavior, external behavior, as though we were rats and didn't know what people are thinking. But wait a second. That's our main peculiarity as higher animals. Elephants know what each other are thinking. Chimpanzees do. Maybe even octopus do. Higher intelligent animals attribute meaning to what people are doing, or what other things are doing. And that's been left out of economics entirely. Now, interestingly, Adam Smith, I always cross myself when I mention Adam Smith. Adam Smith, the great Scottish economist, the inventor of modern economics, essentially, he did humanomics. He used the humanities, philosophy, history, literature even to some degree, to understand what humans were doing. And this is something that economics needs to get back to.
But isn't the issue with some, especially neoclassical economists, would say that, well, we measure choice, right? We don't know why people choose certain things, but we can see that they do, and that's our unit of measure. So
yeah, that's right, and that's nice. But they think you can't measure desire or conflict or tragedy, but that's not true. Of course you can, as easily as you can measure people's consumer choice. And it's an application of Occam's razor with which many men have cut themselves shaving. And to simplify the economy down to these vending machines is not enough. It's not adequate. And the example I give in my book, in this humanomics book, is explaining modern economic growth. If you just keep with the vending machine model, you're completely puzzled by how Danes went from $2 a day in 1800 to $120 or $130 a day now. What? How did that happen? This is in real terms, not an inflation problem. What? How bizarre. How did that happen in only 2 centuries? And vending machines are vending machines. They don't change. They're not ideological. They don't have ethics. They don't think about anything. There's no meaning to a vending machine. There's no free choice. It's a machine. Chung, 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 chung. And what actually happened is that the ideology of liberalism, the ideology that no one should be a slave, rather suddenly in the 1700s in northwestern Europe came to prominence. Famous example is our own American Declaration of Independence, which says all men and women, dear, are created equal. Well, the person who wrote that owned slaves. So he had a big problem with this. But still, that idea kept working and kept gradually expanding. So it extended to freeing the slaves, extended to women. In many ways, it extended to children. It extended to not small children, but teenagers. It extended to gay people. It extended to immigrants. Extended to people of color, to colonial people. Bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's what made for modern economic growth, because it made for the innovism. It made for an economic ideology of striving and being allowed to permit it, being permitted to try out stuff. The English, they say in English, not American English, allowing people to have a go. The British are very sports oriented, and this is a sports metaphor. You play cricket and you get a go, you get to bat for a while, and then the other person has a go. It's an odd expression, and go they went.
So in your next book on the topic, Against Positivism, is that the main critique, that modern economic lost track of this?
They lost track of the meaning of human behavior, but they also devoted themselves to various behaviorisms. For example, institutionalism, neo-institutionalism, which is my main target in the book. Institutions don't work unless people are professionals and have an ethical center and to some degree care for each other. They just fail. So you can't just say, as the World Bank does now, add institutions and stir. That's the same mistake that the World Bank made in the 50s and 60s and 70s and into the 80s. Add investment and stir. It's not enough. It doesn't work. But I'm also opposed to the new behavioral economics, which I think is mechanical.
Oh yeah.
And I'm opposed to neuroeconomics, which confuses the brain with the mind. A mind is not a brain. If it were so, then we could understand, what's his name? Messi, the great soccer player, just moved from Barcelona. We could understand him by looking very closely at his muscles. But that's crazy. The turn that he invented, which is so famous, a trick in front of the goal to get free to shoot. It's called the Messi turn. That is coming from a mind, not a brain. You can look at where the brain lights up, but that doesn't tell you anything about the mind.
Also, lots of those studies has been proven to be faulty anyway, right?
That's true. I have a criticism of modern econometrics, which Steve Ziliak and I have made over many years. And it's that tests of statistical significance are not significant. And that's a disastrous failure of modern econometrics. By the way, the American Statistical Association agrees with us. And a few years ago issued a sort of regulation, wouldn't be the word, but advice not to use mechanical tests of statistical significance the way they are used in psychology, in economics, and most alarmingly, in medicine.
Wow. Could this be, and this is just a thesis, but could this be that there's, with the emphasis on publishing for young academics today, there tends to be a lot of focus on positive findings all the time, and it's very hard to publish, for instance, negative findings, which can be as important.
That's exactly right. There is that. It's called the file drawer problem, that you only publish your positive. But that's an old criticism of econometrics. But this one I'm making is more elementary, really, and it's that. Here's one way to express it. A number does not contain its own interpretation.
True.
No more than words do. So I say, you ask me, how is the weather in Copenhagen this afternoon? And I say to you, 6. You say, 6 what? Well, 6. Don't you believe in numbers? And then you say, but I don't understand. What is it? Is it a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 or 0 to... What exactly is this 6? You say, oh, you're obviously a sloppy humanist. You don't believe in statistics. And that's what's wrong with tests of statistical significance. They think it is. If it doesn't have a loss function, a substantive loss function is the technical way of expressing it. A test of statistical significance doesn't tell you whether something's important or not. Yet we think it does. Think, well, this coefficient is statistically significant. Well, that depends what use you're going to make of it. So it depends on the loss or gain from over or underestimating this number. And in policy terms, it can be really important to overestimate it or to underestimate it. And yet that's not reflected in the method.
So how do we fix this?
We fix it by people getting serious about statistical theory. And they're not. They don't understand what they're doing. And we fix it by people getting serious about economic theory, understanding and by getting serious about the quantitative magnitudes of the economy. Here's a nice number that most people don't know. 14% of job slots in the United States disappear forever every year. 14%. Well, it's true in here too. It's true in every progressive economy. And that means that we can't retrain and subsidize everyone who loses a job. If we do that very quickly, in 3 or 4 years, half the labor force will be on the dole. And if we keep it up, pretty soon 90% of the labor force will be supported by the government. This makes no sense. People, a progressive economy is constantly churning. And if we want poor people to get better off, we've got to let it churn. This, by the way, is true of capital, too. The capital stock, now I'm talking about the physical capital stock, or human capital for that matter, is constantly going out of style, is constantly not just wearing out, but becoming irrelevant. Spectacular example of this in human capital is what was called by the London taxi drivers the knowledge. The knowledge was a very expensively attained knowledge of every street in London. London has a very complicated street plan. And in order to be a black cab driver, you had to pass a test to know every single street in London and how to get from one place to another. And what they used to do is they'd go out on a scooter for a year. They'd spend a whole year investing in learning this. Now, the GPS came. Instantly, that knowledge is useless because you can get a nice voice telling you how to get there. Free.
And current.
And current.
Yeah.
Can be, and actually my daughter updates those systems. She's a geographer. So, but that has to happen for progress. It has to be that the capital, whether human or physical, and the employment has to constantly change. And the trouble is that people are frightened by that, and well, they might. I mean, if they invented a machine that could do scholarship, I would be out of a job. And that would be sad for me. But if they do, they ought to let the machine go. Not go away, but keep going.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Because then we'd get wonderful...
Let it have a go, basically.
We'd let it have a go. We'd have wonderful progress in science and scholarship.
Since such a machine is probably a way off for our field here, what is your advice to young people coming into the field of economics today?
Well, the one thing they should do is learn basic economics. And by that I mean what you would call the Chicago School price theory.
Yeah.
One way to learn it is to read an old book of mine called The Applied Theory of Price. But there's a book by Milton Friedman and George Stigler, The Theory of Price it's called, and Milton Friedman's book is called, Economic Theory. And then there's a book by Gary Becker. There's a book by Thomas Sowell, more elementary book. There's a book by Armin Alchian. These are all people who taught the basic economic way of thinking. And if you don't know that, even if you're a critic of it, even if you think, well, I think socialism is better and these free market people are wrong, your criticisms of economics will be kind of immature and kind of silly unless you know what you're talking about. This man I mentioned, Thomas Piketty, who's a well-known French economist, doesn't understand basic economics. And so, of course, he makes terrible mistakes all the time, even though he's a hard-working guy and so on and so forth. And then the other thing to learn is serious economic history and the quantitative attitude of asking all the time, how much, how much, how much? Because you can say, the Danish economy is filled with monopolies. Isn't it terrible? Supply and demand doesn't work because, God, all these monopolies, they're all over. Then you need to measure. You need to go down and find out how big the monopolies are, what their power is. And then what you will discover, actually, is that they're not very powerful and that monopoly is not a serious problem in the Danish economy or in the American economy. And this is true of lots of things. Do the science, in other words. understand the basic logic. This would be true of a physicist or a historian. Understand the basic logic and then get down to facts.
If I can add something to this, you told me an anecdote a while back that Milton Friedman used to say something when you had seminars in Chicago. I think that is a good advice too.
It was crucial advice. Milton used to say, "How do you know?" And it often wasn't a hostile question. He just wanted to know how you know, because he wanted to know if you had any information that he didn't have, logical or empirical. And I learned it this way. The first week I was an assistant professor in economics at the University of Chicago. I was at a cocktail party with Milton Friedman and other colleagues. And we were all gathered around Milton. Milton was very short. And I had read a popular column that Milton had done last week in an American magazine called Newsweek. He had a column for many years. And in that column, he pointed out the ways in which American sports leagues, the baseball league and the football league and the basketball league, those three, were monopolies. And I'd read it the week before and thought, boy, that's right. And we were gathered around Milton, and I said, well, you know, American sports leagues are monopolies. And Milton looked up at me. I was much taller than Milton. He said, how do you know? And I could hardly say, I know because you told me so last week. And that would be undignified for an assistant professor to say. So I just mumbled something and walked away, got away as far as I could. But at least I had the sense to learn from that. That if you ask, how do you know of every sentence you write? How do I know this? With the implication, do you really know it? What's your evidence for it? Is it logically consistent with what you just said? Does it cohere your argument? If you do that with every sentence you write, you will become a great economic scientist. If you never do it, you'll become a bad economic scientist.
That's some really, really good advice. We could end here, but I have a couple more questions
Go ahead.
I need to ask. So just going back on what you said there, so it wasn't hostile when he gave that advice.
No.
But I think many people would experience it hostile, especially today.
Well, I know if they're soft, say, "Oh, you've got to treat me with respect. Oh, I'm so delicate." And I learned at Chicago. Actually, I learned it before, and from John Mayer when I was a transport economist, and then from Alexander Gershenkron when I was in economic history. I learned to be tough especially in myself. When I revise what I write, I'm looking to improve the style, and I've written a book on English style called Economical Writing, a short book. But I'm mainly checking the logic and the facts, and asking Milton's question over and over again: how do I know? Does this make sense? And it's the only way to go.
Jumping to another thing here, but one thing I have to cover as well is you wrote a very famous criticism of economics called Economic Rhetoric.
Yes, that's right.
Has that improved?
No.
No.
Not at all. I had no effect at all. This was an article, everyone read it and was very excited by it. They hated it, usually most of them, because they didn't read it very carefully. So they thought I was suggesting that economics use more flowery language or something stupid like that. And I still get people saying that to me. And then from that, I wrote a book called The Rhetoric of Economics. And that book said that economists were poets. They used metaphors. And then I wrote a book called If You're So Smart, where I said economists are novelists and use stories. And then because both of these books, especially the first, got economists and philosophers so angry at me that I wrote a third book answering the critics called Knowledge and Persuasion in Economics. So those three books were a trilogy in the 1980s and 90s. And they've had no influence at all, as far as I can tell. And that's okay. I mean, you can't change everything.
I can recommend to listeners to actually dig into some of that debate. It's quite fun to read.
Yeah, yeah.
I found an old, I think it was a review by my old teacher, Duke Bruce, who actually reviewed your original article. And so I think it was funny to read. And really Bruce coming in on an editor. So
that's right.
I thought it was interesting. So I think my last question will be, where do you hope the economic science or profession, if those are two different things, maybe the same thing, is in 100 years? What have we accomplished as a field in 100 years?
Well, we have accomplished a great deal to look back. Economics is much better than it was, say, in 1800. But it reached kind of a peak in 1848 and then in some ways deteriorated over the next 100 years. I have an essay making this point. But no, I think what I hope is, I'm not sure I think it, I'm not sure I expect it, but I hope that economists broaden themselves and become what Bob Heilbronner called worldly philosophers. And that means taking philosophy seriously, taking ethics seriously, taking history, and even literature seriously. Not just as sources of information, but as asking questions. The question, for example, what motivates people in the economy? And lots of things do that we don't take adequate account of.
So become more like Adam Smith, basically.
Absolutely, more like Adam Smith.
So thank you so much for chatting with me today. I'm sure my listeners will enjoy these insights. I certainly learned a lot.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed. I always find that conversation, I learn things. And if you find that in your conversing with colleagues or friends or your husband or something, you're not learning things, then you're not having a very good conversation.
True. That's a good way to end it. Thank you so much, Deirdre.
Thank you, dear.